Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people story. How do you fight an HOA that's trying to take your house? My HOA president decided a strip of my land was a community easement and sent in a construction crew. When I stopped them, the fines and foreclosure threats started piling up. It seemed like a hopeless fight. So, how did I turn the tables so hard that they ended up paying me thousands of dollars and building me a brand new fence? I want to start this by saying, I am not someone who looks for fights. I own a house, I mow my lawn, I wave at neighbors, and I mind my business. But there is a point where minding your business stops working, and you have to actually deal with what's in front of you. This is the story of how the HOA president in my neighborhood tried to seize a piece of my property by inventing a legal concept she clearly did not understand, and how it blew up so spectacularly in her face that she ended up resigning from the board in disgrace. Let me set the scene. About 2 years ago, I bought a house on what the real estate listing called a flag lot. If you don't know what that is, it's basically a property with an irregular shape where part of the lot is a long, narrow strip connecting to the main body of the parcel. Mine wasn't a textbook flag lot, but it had a similar quirk because of the way the neighborhood was originally platted. The corner of the block I'm on has an odd geometry, and the way the surveyor divided up the land back in the day left me with a property that includes a narrow strip of land running along my side yard, between my fence and the public sidewalk. The strip is about 10 feet wide and maybe 60 feet long. Here's the thing about that strip that turned out to be extremely important later. It is not technically part of my main residential lot. It is its own separate deeded parcel. The previous owner of my house had also owned the strip separately, and the deed history showed both parcels passing together through every sale for decades. They were always sold together, always taxed together, always treated as one unit. But legally, they were two distinct parcels with two distinct deeds and two lines on the plat map. The previous owner of the house was, of all things, a retired land surveyor. The man had spent his entire career measuring and recording property boundaries, and he was the kind of person who took that work seriously even after he stopped doing it professionally. He had every survey of his property professionally redone every 10 years or so, and when I bought the house, I inherited a folder so thick with land documentation that the closing attorney actually commented on it. There were stamped, certified surveys, recorded plat references, deed histories, the works. At the time, I thought it was a little excessive. I kept the folder in my filing cabinet and basically forgot it existed. Now let me tell you about the strip itself. It is landscaped. The previous owner clearly loved it. There were low-maintenance ornamental grasses along the fence line, a few mature shrubs, and a layer of mulch over the whole thing that someone had refreshed recently before he sold. From the street, especially if you didn't know what you were looking at, it looked like a narrow park buffer or a decorative zone between the sidewalk and the fence. Nothing about it screamed, "This is somebody's private property." It just looked like a green, nicely kept space that happened to be there. That ambiguity turned out to be the whole problem. The HOA in my neighborhood was run at the time by a woman who had been president for about 3 years. She had strong opinions about the aesthetic of the neighborhood and a tendency to treat every suggestion she had as though it were already a community-approved project that just needed execution. Most of the neighbors found her exhausting but tolerated her because the fines for minor violations were real and she was not shy about issuing them. Grass too long? Fine. Trash cans visible from the street past a certain hour? Fine. She had the rule book memorized and she liked using it. I had a few minor run-ins with her in my first months living there. Nothing serious, just the normal calibration of learning what the HOA cared about. I got a verbal notice once about some patio furniture that was visible from the street. I moved it. End of story, or so I thought. Then one afternoon in late spring, I pulled into my driveway after work and stopped the car because something was wrong with the strip. There was a landscaping crew out there, maybe 4 guys, and they had orange spray paint and small orange survey stakes. They were marking something out along the length of the strip, and there was a wheelbarrow of gravel sitting on the sidewalk. I got out of the car and walked over, and one of the crew members looked up and I asked him what was going on. He told me, in a pretty matter-of-fact way, that the HOA had contracted them to install a gravel walking path through the community easement. I stood there for a second. I asked him to repeat that. He said it again. Community easement, gravel path, HOA job. Here is what I did not do. I did not yell at him. I did not tell them to stop or get off my property. I went back to my house, changed out of my work clothes, grabbed a lawn chair and a cold drink, and I came back out and set up the chair on the grass about 10 feet from where they were working. One of the crew guys looked at me kinda confused, and I just told him, real calm, that I'd hold off on starting anything if I were them, because there was gonna be some paperwork to sort out first. The foreman asked me if there was a problem, and I said there wasn't a problem exactly, just a question about the ownership of the land they were about to put gravel on. He stopped his guys and pulled out his phone to call whoever had hired them. Within about 15 minutes, the HOA president came marching across the street. She had a folder with some papers in it, and the look on her face said she was annoyed that anyone had paused the project. She launched into an explanation before I even said anything. She said the board had voted to create a community nature path connecting the two cul-de-sacs at either end of my block, and that it would run through the existing buffer zone along my property. She said the buffer zone was a community easement maintained by the HOA under their authority over common area improvements. She said the project had been approved, and the contractor had been hired, and she would appreciate it if I would clear my lawn chair and let them work. I waited for her to finish. Then I asked her one question. I asked her to show me the recorded easement document. She opened her folder and pulled out a piece of paper and handed it to me. I looked at it and I had to read it twice to make sure I was understanding what I was seeing. It was a brochure, not even a recent one. It was a photocopied, slightly blurry brochure from what appeared to be the original developer of the subdivision, probably printed in the early 2000s. It showed a little map of the neighborhood with a dotted line representing a proposed walking trail that ran along the edge of the block. The dotted line passed through the area where my strip was located. I looked up at her, and she had this confident expression on her face, like she had just produced the most compelling evidence in history. She told me that the brochure represented the developer's original intent for the community, which in her words created a constructive easement that the HOA had the right to act on. She said this like it was a well-established legal principle. I want to be clear that a constructive easement is not a thing in property law, at least not the way she was using it. What she was describing does not exist. A developer's marketing brochure showing a proposed amenity that was never built, never recorded, never included in any deed or plat or legal instrument does not create any kind of property right for anyone. But she said it with complete confidence and a tone that suggested I should be embarrassed for making her explain this to me. I took out my phone and photographed the brochure. Then I said, pretty quietly, that I was going to need a couple of days to look into this before I could let any work proceed on that strip of land. I told the contractor foreman the same thing. The foreman, who looked deeply uncomfortable with the whole situation, said that was fine and his crew could come back once everything was sorted out. The president looked like she wanted to argue, but the contractor was already telling his guys to load up. Over the next 2 days, I did 3 things. First, I dug out the folder from the previous owner. I found the survey for the strip, which was a separate document from the main lot survey, stamped and certified, showing the strip as its own parcel with its own dimensions and boundary descriptions. Second, I found both deeds, the main lot deed and the strip deed, each referencing the other but each legally distinct. Third, I called my county's assessor office and confirmed that yes, both parcels were assessed separately and both showed me as the owner of record. The strip was paying taxes independently, it had been for years. I also did one more thing. I called a real estate attorney just to make sure I was understanding everything correctly. The attorney looked at what I described and said that unless there was a recorded easement document in the public record attached to the deed, there was no easement. A developer brochure was not a recorded document. It created no legal interest in the property whatsoever. The attorney also mentioned, kind of offhand, that if the HOA had been collecting common area maintenance fees from me that included the strip, and the strip was not HOA common area, that could be a problem for them. I hadn't thought about that yet, but it stuck in my head. 3 days after the original incident, I got a formal notice taped to my door. The HOA was fining me $500 per day for what they called obstructing community amenities. The notice said I had interfered with authorized HOA contractors, and that I had until the end of the month to allow the project to proceed or the fines would continue to accrue. A week after that, I got another notice. This one said that because of unpaid fines, I was now in violation of my HOA agreement and that they were initiating foreclosure proceedings on my property. Let that sink in for a second. They were threatening to foreclose on my house over a gravel path through a strip of land they didn't own. Some of my neighbors started getting curious about what was going on. A few of them were on the president's side because the path would have given them a shortcut between the two cul-de-sacs, shaving about 5 minutes off the walk. A couple of them came by and asked me why I was holding up the project. One neighbor was pretty blunt about it and said she didn't understand why I was being difficult about a community improvement that everyone else supported. I didn't explain everything at that point. I just said I had some documentation questions that needed to be resolved before anyone started construction. I was polite about it. But I also noticed the foreclosure notice on my door was the kind of thing that got people talking, and I knew the situation was getting more serious. The following week, I came home on a Tuesday evening to find a bulldozer parked at the curb in front of my strip. It wasn't actively working, it was just sitting there like a threat. A message. We're coming whether you like it or not. I went inside and I made a phone call to the county code enforcement office and explained the situation. The officer I spoke with asked me if I had documentation of ownership. I said I had a certified copy of the deed and the survey with a county seal. He said to have it available and he would send someone out the next morning. Then I drove down to the county recorder's office before they closed and I requested certified copies of both deeds and the official plat map for my block, with gold seals, not photocopies, certified official documents, the kind that hold up in any legal proceeding. That evening, I also called my attorney back and told her about the bulldozer and the foreclosure notice. She told me to document everything, photograph the bulldozer, save the notices, and call the non-emergency police line in the morning when the contractor arrived and report a potential trespass. The next morning, I was up before 7. I made coffee. I waited. The landscaping crew showed up around 8:30 and the bulldozer operator started his engine. I walked out to the sidewalk, stood near the edge of my strip, and called the non-emergency police line. I told the dispatcher that a contractor was about to begin work on my private property without my permission or any legal authorization, and I believed it was about to become a trespass situation. The dispatcher sent a patrol officer. The code enforcement officer arrived at about the same time as the police officer, which I hadn't expected but was very glad for. By this point, the HOA president had materialized again, standing near the bulldozer with her folder. The contractor had paused when he saw the police car pull up. The officer asked what was happening. Both me and the president started to answer at the same time, and he held up a hand and had us each explain separately. She went first. She laid out the community easement argument, the developer's intent, the board vote, the approved contractor, the whole thing. She handed the officer a copy of the brochure. Then it was my turn. I handed the officer the certified plat map and the certified deed for the strip. I pointed to the parcel numbers. I pointed to my name as owner of record. I showed him the separate survey for the strip. I told him that there was no recorded easement attached to this property in any public document, that I had verified this personally at the county recorder's office, and that the strip had been paying property taxes in my name since I purchased it. The code enforcement officer leaned over and looked at the documents. He asked the HOA president if the HOA had pulled a permit for the construction. She said the HOA didn't need a permit for amenity improvements on common areas. He told her that this was not HOA common area. He pointed to the plat map. He pointed to the deed. He said the HOA would need a valid recorded easement and a proper construction permit to do any work here, and that absent both of those things, any construction would be an unpermitted build on private property, which was a violation he would have to cite. The president looked at the bulldozer operator. He was already shutting down his machine. The police officer told the crew that they needed to pack up and leave the property, and that if they proceeded without the owner's permission and proper legal documentation, they would be subject to a trespass charge. The contractor didn't argue. His guys started loading equipment. The president was not quiet about her feelings. She told the officer that I was obstructing a legitimate community project and that the board had legal authority to act on the strip. The officer told her, very calmly, that he had seen the deed and that the deed showed the land belonged to me, and that unless she could produce a recorded easement from the county's own records, the board's authority did not extend to my property. That's when I brought up something I had been holding back. I mentioned to the code enforcement officer, loud enough for the president to hear, that the HOA had been billing me me for a master policy assessment every year that included a line item for common area maintenance. I had been paying it, along with everyone else in the neighborhood, because I assumed it was standard. But if the strip was not HOA common area, and it clearly wasn't, then I had been paying into a fund to maintain land I actually owned outright for years. The officer noted that down, but said it was a civil matter, not something he could act on at the scene. But he made sure to write it into his report. The code enforcement citation came through within a week. The HOA was fined for attempting to begin unpermitted construction on what the city's records clearly showed as private property. The fine was significant, several $1,000s, and it came with a formal notice that any future attempt to build on the strip without proper permitting and proof of easement would result in escalating penalties. I hired my attorney to file a civil suit against the HOA. The core of the case was straightforward. The HOA had tried to seize my private property by claiming it was common area, had fined me $500 per day for refusing to allow it, had threatened foreclosure, and had been charging me annual fees for maintaining land I owned. The suit asked for the fines to be voided, the foreclosure threat to be formally rescinded, and reimbursement of the common area maintenance premiums I had been paying for the strip parcel for the 5 years prior to my ownership that were included in the HOA's own assessment history, plus harassment damages. The board's response to the lawsuit was about what you'd expect. Their attorney sent back a letter suggesting that the case had no merit and that the HOA had acted within its authority. But anyone who read the deed and the plat map could see that this position was not going to survive contact with a judge. My attorney was confident, and she let theirs know fairly directly that we were prepared to take this to a full trial if necessary. What followed was about 6 weeks of back and forth that I will spare you the details of, except to say that the HOA board was clearly getting nervous. A couple of board members reached out to me privately to say they had not fully understood the situation and were working to resolve it. I told them politely that my attorney was handling communications. Then one evening my attorney called me and said the HOA wanted to settle. She walked me through their offer. Every fine that had been issued to me was voided, retroactively and in writing, with a formal acknowledgement from the board that the fines had been issued in error. The foreclosure proceeding was dropped and expunged from my records with the county. The HOA would pay me back for the portion of common area assessment fees that had been incorrectly attributed to the strip parcel, going back 5 years, which came out to just over $4,000 once you calculated what the strip's square footage represented as a percentage of what they defined as common area. On top of that, harassment damages that my attorney had negotiated to a number I was satisfied with. And then there was one more item on the list that I honestly didn't expect. The HOA agreed to pay for the installation of a high-quality wrought iron fence along the street-facing perimeter of the strip. The stated reason in the settlement was permanent clear delineation of private property boundaries. In other words, they were going to pay to fence off the land they had tried to take from me so that no one in the future could claim they hadn't understood it was private property. My attorney said it was one of the more satisfying settlements she had seen in a neighborhood dispute. About 2 weeks after the settlement was signed, there was a special HOA board meeting. I didn't attend, but a neighbor who did told me about it afterward. The meeting was short. The board announced that the president had submitted her resignation effective immediately. The neighbor said she didn't say much at the meeting, just that she felt it was time to step aside and let someone else take the role. She left before the rest of the meeting was done. The neighborhood talked about it for a while. Some people were shocked. Some people had seen it coming. A few people who had been on her side about the path thing started to understand once the details got around that she had nearly bankrupted the HOA by pushing a project on land the HOA had no legal claim to. The legal costs alone from the settlement and the code enforcement fine had cost the HOA tens of thousands of dollars, which came out of the reserve fund that was supposed to cover actual maintenance of actual common areas. The wrought iron fence went up about a month later. The contractor who did it was professional, and it looked good, honestly. Clean black iron, consistent height with a small gate at one end so I could access the strip from my yard. The fencing company installed a small sign at the front corner which I had requested as part of the installation. The sign says, "Private property, no trespassing." I put a bench in there, nothing fancy, just a garden bench from a hardware store. I painted it dark green so it blends with the ornamental grasses. On weekend afternoons when the weather is nice, I sit out there with something cold to drink and I enjoy my strip of land that the previous owner, bless that meticulous surveyor, had documented with such precision that it made the whole thing airtight from the start. The two cul-de-sacs are still not connected by a walking path. The neighbors who wanted the shortcut still have to walk around. The long way takes about 5 minutes. On nice days when I'm sitting on my bench, a few of them pass by on the sidewalk. Most of them just walk past without looking over. A couple of them have nodded at me kind of grudgingly. My wife thinks it's petty of me to sit out there. I told her I'm not doing it to make a point. I'm doing it because it's my property and it's a nice place to sit. She said that's what someone who's definitely making a point would say. She's probably right, but that bench isn't going anywhere. The lesson I take from all of this is pretty simple. Know what you own, keep your documents. Don't assume that someone who talks with authority actually has any. The HOA president had been operating in that neighborhood for years on the basis of confidence and a willingness to out-persist anyone who questioned her. She had never run into someone who had a certified copy of a deed and the patience to wait for the right moment to use it. The folder that the previous owner put together, the one with all those surveys and deeds and stamps and certifications, sat in my filing cabinet for almost 2 years before I had any reason to open it. When I finally did, it was worth every sheet of paper in it. The last thing I'll say is this. After everything was settled, I found out from the county recorder that the HOA had never actually formally assessed the strip as common area in their own governing documents. They had been including it in their maintenance budget calculations based on a note in an internal spreadsheet from years ago. Someone had marked it as a buffer zone, and over time the board had just assumed it was theirs. Nobody had ever checked the deed. One line in a spreadsheet, that's what started all of it. So check your deeds, people. You might own something you don't even know about. The next one is a malicious compliance story. So, a little backstory. I work for an internet provider company as a lead in the internet repair department. This means that I get calls from agents who work there that either need help with a situation because they are stuck and don't know what to do, or when a customer escalates the call asking for a supervisor, manager, or someone above them. My department mainly handles internet issues like being offline, outages, replacing equipment, etc. So the other day was like any other. I'm getting calls from agents needing equipment transferred from one account to another, scheduling a technician for customers who refuse to do any troubleshooting. The list goes on and on. One of my main calls is an agent asking for me to run a special tool that corrects the speed being sent to a customer. This usually happens when a customer upgrades or downgrades their internet speed and it doesn't take right away, and this only takes a couple minutes. This comes in later. On this particular day, I get a call from an agent that says her customer wants to speak to a supervisor because he is not getting the speeds he pays for. This happens quite a lot, usually because most people don't understand how the internet works and all the factors that come into the result of a speed test. This can include a lot of things, like how far away you are from your router, if you are testing on Wi-Fi or directly connected, how many devices you are currently using, and even things like how your residence is built, because stone and concrete do not allow Wi-Fi signals to travel through. When I looked at the customer's account, I see that he is currently subscribed to 100 megabits per second. Our normal plans are 300, 500, and a gig, which is 1,000. I asked the agent what results he was getting, and she told me it was 437 megabits per second, which is way over what he is paying for. I told the agent to go ahead and transfer him to me, and I'll continue the discussion. Once the customer gets to me, we'll call him Darren. I introduce myself and ask how I can help. Darren immediately begins yelling and cursing at me about how he is not getting what he pays for and is extremely upset and even demanding credit to his account because of this. I begin to try and apologize to Darren and explain that speed test results can vary based on certain conditions. He cuts me off and states that he is recording the call and will be posting everything I say on social media. I tell him that that is fine, as all our calls are recorded for quality assurance purposes as well, and everything will be documented. Darren then proceeds to continue cursing, stating that this is unacceptable and I should be ashamed of myself for working for a company that does not provide the product people are paying for. While he rants on and on, I noticed that he had recently changed his internet plan from 500 megabits per second to 100 megabits per second 2 days ago. Now, as I mentioned before, sometimes the internet changes don't happen right away, and we have to run a specific tool to fix it. This can happen when the modem has not been reset to reflect these changes. I try to tell Darren that he is receiving more than what he is paying for, and again, he cuts me off, stating that he will be reporting us to the FCC, BBB, and filing a lawsuit about this, all while recording our conversation. Now, normally I wouldn't care, and I'd allow the speed to continue going through until the system automatically fixes it, but his attitude and rude demeanor made me feel otherwise. Cue the malicious compliance. I respond to Darren saying, "Sir, you are absolutely right, and I am so sorry you are not receiving the speeds you are paying for. I will get this fixed right away." Now, this plan that Darren was on, the 100 speed, is a plan that only certain customers can get if they are financially unable to make normal payments, meaning he had to apply for this program and be approved based on his low income. So, I run the fix tool on his internet and reduce the speed down to 100 as he requested. I then ask him how his speed results are now. Darren then responds, "It's even worse than it was before. What kind of trick are you trying to pull on me?" I responded, "Sir, you told me you were not getting the speeds you were paying for, and you were right. You recently applied for financial assistance to be downgraded to 100, and I fixed that for you. It was absolutely wrong of us to be sending you 500 when you were only paying for 100. I apologize for the inconvenience." After a few minutes of silence, Darren then muffled to himself, "This is ridiculous," and proceeded to disconnect the call. I left notes on his account so any future agent would know what had happened that day, and that he was not entitled to any credit on his bill. All I can say is, be careful what you complain about. The next one is an entitled people story. This story takes place in Abisko in northern Sweden, where a lot of my other stories have taken place. You can look up the area on the map, but I will give a quick description of the relevant geography. Abisko is in the northern end of a valley that runs north to south. The eastern side of the valley is pretty flat. Along the western side of the valley, there is a river going north-south as well, and it flows inside a fairly dramatic river canyon. It's not a huge canyon, but it does have 5 to 15 meters tall, sheer cliff walls with the river on the bottom. To the west of the river, you have mountain slopes. The western half of the valley, including the river and the mountain slopes, are inside a national park. So the story begins proper. This takes place back in 2014. I was going out with a group for some aurora chasing with the snowmobiles. A couple of guests were driving their own machines while Karen and her friends opted to ride in the sled behind my snowmobile. We drive south from the village and along the edge of the national park. After a while, we stop at a nice open area with a great view of a clear night sky as well as the mountains surrounding the valley as well as the large lake to the north. All in all, a great spot for aurora watching and photographing. When we stop, I notice that there is a little bit of aurora starting, so I tell everyone we will stay there for a bit and see what the aurora decides to do. Karen is now poking at her phone and waves me over and tells me we have to go over there while pointing at the mountains on the western side of the valley. This has me a bit confused and I ask her why. Because that's where the aurora is. Now do note that aurora happens about 100 kilometers, 1,538,461 fallow deer hoof prints, or so of the ground. So moving to the other side of the valley won't change any of that. As long as we have a clear sky, the location won't really change the aurora. Of course I tell Karen this, but she refuses to believe some stupid aurora guide when her phone has told her the secrets of the universe. Now Karen shows me her phone with the map and a dropped pin showing the best area for spotting aurora in the region. The pin has been dropped on the side of the mountain Slottichoka in the middle of one of the most dangerous avalanche slopes in all of Scandinavia. It's an area every local knows to avoid like the plague in winter. That slope even killed several people heli-skiing last winter. And Karen wants us to, the snowmobiles there, to all get buried under a massive amount of snow coming crashing down the side of the mountain. And to make it even more exciting, there is also the national park, which you are not allowed to drive a snowmobile inside apart from a couple of official trails. There is of course no official trail to where Karen wants to go. And as icing on the cake, we would need to cross the previously mentioned river canyon, you know, the one with sheer cliff walls and a fast-flowing river on the bottom, so I just need to make the snowmobiles fly over that, I guess. Now, most sensible people would probably realize that what they asked for was impossible, but not Karen. Karen expects to be served and not to hear excuses, and she literally tells me to stop making up dumb excuses and do my job and take them to the aurora. At this point, the Aurora is starting to get a bit stronger, and I decide it's time to let Karen have a bit of a timeout, so I just tell her the Aurora is getting stronger, and I walk away over to some of the other guests to help them set up their camera. For the rest of the tour, she kept occasionally complaining that I was not a proper guide, and I didn't know anything about Aurora, and that I was an incompetent guide who didn't use her amazing app for finding the best spots and so on and so forth. I pretty much just ignored her and focused on the other guests who were having a good time. When we got back, she complained a bit more, and apparently I would be lucky if I didn't get fired when she talked to my boss the next day. I called the owner of the hotel to let him know we were back safe and sound, and that we had a Karen. He just laughed and said she must be completely stupid. Apparently she has showed up at the reception the next day to complain and try to get me in trouble. Let's just say the owner was not impressed with Karen's phone app, and he basically told her to go duck off back to her home planet. The hotel did receive a 1-star review on Google claiming we were all rude and incompetent. We all cried a solitary tear afterwards. Anyway, thank you for watching.